And thanks again for the opportunity to host this event. Hi, everyone, and welcome to this installment of the webinar series from the MPA in collaboration with the Infrastructure and Projects Authority. Previous events that we've had in this series were discussing accelerating major projects, how major projects are tackling social and economic inequalities, and the role of the Chief Projects Officer. So a little bit about myself. My name is Lucian Awayo. I'll be your host for this afternoon. I work at Accenture in their capital projects and infrastructure practice. I've been there for about 2 years and working mainly on Hinkley Point C, the nuclear new build projects in the south of England. Before Accenture, I was working as a graduate engineer in water treatment and after doing my master's degree in chemical engineering. Since my time at Accenture, I've been involved with the MPA, first as part of the Early Careers Network, and was also in last year's cohort for the Rising Stars program as well. So today we'll be exploring orienteering in major projects. How can you navigate to where you want to if you don't know where you are? Orienteering is defined as an activity that involves using a map and compass to navigate from point to point in diverse and usually unfamiliar terrain whilst moving at speed. In the major projects that we all work on, I'm sure we're all accustomed to diverse and unfamiliar terrain while meeting tight deadlines and delivering at pace. But to paraphrase Mark Wilde, where many projects go wrong in this journey and in the orienteering process is putting a lot of focus on where we've come from and where we are going, but not looking at where we are now, which is critically important. It's when we end up realizing different parts of the project believe that they're in different stages and different places that we start to see some of the common issues across many major projects. Today, we want to answer this question of really knowing where we are at any point when delivering major programs. From my own perspective, a common theme that I've come across is one of systems thinking, which we've had previously had a webinar on with the MPA. I think that a holistic and transparent view of the progress of the project from all aspects, whether it's construction, digital systems, procurement, or commissioning, allows the key decision makers to trust the information that they have and make the best choices at the right time to deliver the whole system effectively. But how can we draw on our collective knowledge to achieve this and advance major projects delivery? Well, we have an amazing panel today with a great range of experience from various major projects from all over the world. And I've done a bit of research, calculated that it's almost 100 years of experience collectively. So we're in good hands today. I'll introduce them one by one. So I'll start with Mark Wilde. Mark was appointed CEO of SGN in August last year after being CEO of Crossrail, where he led the delivery of the largest infrastructure project in Europe at the time. An electrical engineer by trade, Mark started his career in the electricity sector, but the majority of his experience has been in transportation, where he has over 35 years experience leading complex and critical infrastructure, including roles at Transport for London and Public Transport Victoria in Australia. Up next, we'll hear from Lisa Kelvey. Lisa is a partner at KPMG and director of their major projects advisory practice. She has 20 years experience of planning and delivering major programs, specializing in supporting program leaders with strategy, planning, decision-making, and assurance for major programs and portfolios. A chartered civil engineer, Lisa started her career with a major international design consultancy before moving into project management and advisory roles. Our next speaker will be Jo Ellman-Brown. Jo is the Deputy Director for Transport at the Infrastructure and Projects Authority. She has extensive experience in project management and project controls, including roles as a PMO Director at Heathrow and Head of Project Controls and Project Delivery within the MOD. Last but not least, we'll hear from Beth West. Beth is the CEO of the East West Rail Company, delivering a new rail link between Oxford and Cambridge, which will be over 100 kilometres in length. Some of Beth's previous roles include being Managing Director at Balfour Beatty, Commercial Director at HS2, and 9 years in several roles at Transport for London. Beth has a rich knowledge of the transport sector and a long track record in driving construction innovation. An example of that innovation is the target state approach at the East West Rail Company, where by simplifying and removing unnecessary systems, you can define a clear picture of what is needed to run a fully functional railway. So there's our speakers for today, and I think we'll move on first to hear from Mark on his view of orienteering on Crossrail.
Hi, everybody. Hello, Lucian. Can you hear me and see me okay, Lucian?
Yes, all good. Thanks, Mark.
I'm going to pop up my slides, which is always a bit of a challenging moment. This is such a great webinar to be part of. I really believe, I was listening to that biography of Beth there, and I think she's doing it brilliantly in East-West. These things are major programs. It's kind of obstacle avoidance, really, isn't it? It's a much more agile, dynamic thing than just conventionally what people might have thought projects were 30 or 40 years ago. I think for me, I often go back to the example of Crossroads. I think it's so obvious for people. And also, a lot of people on this call would have worked for Crossrail, with Crossrail. And it's just like a really good case study. And as a lot of people know, in the summer of 2018, Crossrail lost its sense of situation, lost its situational awareness. It had 8 months to go, but, reality was we had 4 years to go. How on earth could we possibly have made such a mistake? And I was on the board. I wasn't, no way I could wash my hands of this. I was definitely there accepting the project controls information that was coming through, that this was actually possible. And the interesting thing about Crossrail is the project controls fraternity was really very, very good. Some of the best people in the world. We spent unlimited money on it, unlimited, tens of millions of pounds. And they used the most advanced tools and techniques of the time, kind of the state of the art. So how could it be that we got so compressed and so kind of out of synchronism that we literally, there were 75,000 activities in the supply chains programs that had got lost down the back of the sofa of the client? How could that occur? And I think I've got a couple of slides that might promote a bit of conversation in the Q&A and hopefully complement my fellow speakers. Both of them are in the context of a precursor kind of culture that I think is essential. And the first one is the ability for people to speak truth to power. So the slides I'm going to show aren't rocket science. There's only 2 of them and they're graphical, but they only really work if you could create an environment where people could speak truth to power. And the reality is, in Crossrail, nobody's fault, it just occurred, that a culture evolved which wasn't transparent and people couldn't speak. So first thing I'll say about orienteering is, before you start orienteering, you better have a culture where people can speak and see the truth, see the truth. The second sort of precursor, I would say, to orienteering is to remove the fear of failure, because I believe ultimately why Crossrail became more and more opaque was good people, brilliant people, just would not want to fail. It became too big to fail. And as people strove even harder, they became closer to the dance floor, when, as we all know as leaders, the art of major programs or significant engineering leadership is to stay on the balcony. That's our job. Yeah, we stay on the balcony as leaders. The minute you're on the dance floor, you lose situational awareness. So I guess for me, 2 simple slides from me about what I think. If you did have an environment where people can speak truth to power, and if you do have an environment where there is reduced fear of failure, I think there are the 2 perspectives that would help you orienteer. First one is, I've used this chart a couple of times in recent past. Think of 2 axes, just a simple perspective this, and I'll see these 2 axes as possibility and reality as really muscles. And I guess this could apply to major programs leaders, this could apply to project controls leaders, this could apply to system integrators, engineers, anybody really in the ecosystem of major programs. I think there are 2 muscles you need to successfully orienteer. First one is the bottom one, ambition, possibility. Now that one really, in this community, generally you find that muscle very evident. You don't tend to do the jobs we do without being very, very passionate and have a lot of skills and capability in that bottom axis. Ambition, possibility, what is possible is generally a good muscle to have, and you see it a lot in major programs. The vertical axis, though, and again, I would think of these as like muscles and core competencies. The vertical axis is reality. And I don't mean your perception of reality, I mean the deterministic reality. How possible is it to do something, but also how realistic is it? And what happened in Crossrail was, for example, they started to use a measure in program controls of completedness, which is a really good measure, earned value. But it became the target, not the measure, percentage completedness. And I think it's well known around July 18, with 6 or 7 months to go, the project was declaring itself 95% complete, which it was actually. It was the right measure. Nobody was lying, but it was a measure that really didn't determine the reality. It was kind of in that bottom right-hand corner. It was highly ambitious, 95% complete. But what it meant was nothing was really connected, because in the last 5%, the reality is of any major program, ever since I guess the pharaohs built the pyramids, the last 5% will take 20% of the time. So whether you're East West Rail, Hinkley C, HS2 or Crossrail, or some job in Neon, I can guarantee to you the last 5% will take 20% of the time. And for some reason in Crossrail, the last throw of the dice, interestingly, the last throw of the dice, which meant this program wasn't achievable, the last 5% was estimated to take 3% of the time. Now, so that distortion of reality really is an anathema to orienteering. So first thing I would say is you've got to have a culture of speaking truth to power. Then I think you need to have ambition and reality in equal power. And I would definitely see these as muscles, you know, and that's what I would be looking for in a major program. And the second slide is kind of an interesting one. A lot of colleagues on here from the IPA, and it's not meant in any way as a criticism because I was sitting on the board, but I think the IPA did many studies of Crossrail. I think it gave it ambers, amber reds occasionally. NAO looked at Crossrail. We actually had 4 layers of assurance, including an embedded project representative with really excellent people from Jacobs. Generally, the ecosystem of assurance around Crossrail was kind of raising a few concerns, but it didn't spot the black hole. How could it be? And I really believe that the assurance structure, the radar system, you know, the extent that people monitor and scrutinize programs, they were all there in Crossrail, but it was the wrong mindset. So the thing I would add to my muscles of reality and possibility, the other thing I would add is curiosity and the ability of the center, you know, that left-hand side of my chart here, the governance structures, you know, the sponsor board, the executive board, the actual delivery authorities board, really needed a spirit of curiosity, where red was seen to be actually quite a useful color, red, because you could be curious about it. And you certainly want things to tend towards red rather than tend towards green. If you had like if it was like a marginal decision, and Crossrail ended up with a lot of amber red. So I guess for any emerging major programs leader on this call, the colors to be very worried about are amber reds, which generally mean it's red. And I think the spirit of curiosity would be useful. So I think in summary for me, firstly, can you create the environment where people can speak truth to power? An inclusive environment where everybody's views count? Can you remove the fear of failure from people? So the consequence is what you might term owning the whole rather than people feeling victimized. And then if you could get there, can you have equal reality and possibility? And secondly, particularly when it comes to assurance, can you increase the curiosity of programs? And I believe this is the future of major programs. They're getting bigger and more complex. I've said a couple of times on events like this, that Crossrail used to be the biggest program in Europe and the 4th biggest in the world. Crossrail wouldn't get in the Nowhere would Crossrail get in the top 3 anymore in Europe or the top 10 in the world. HS2's 3, 4, 5 times bigger than Crossrail. So if you were the CEO of HS2, I would have said, and I think Mark was really, really good at this, how would you create this culture of curiosity and leaning into things and keep your reality at the same time a possibility? And with that, Lucian, I will hand back to you and I'll stop sharing.
Thanks, Mark, and right on time as well. Yeah, that was really interesting, especially looking at those flexing those muscles of ambition and reality. I think many people probably have much stronger ambition and then without the reflection on the reality, and that's what can cause some of these issues. Thanks, Mark. So our next speaker is Lisa Kelvey, and she'll be explaining to us why project controls are out of control.
Lovely, thanks, Lucian. So I think I'm going to shock you all here that I'm a consultant coming on here with no slides, but I thought that I would just share my views from over 20 years in this industry and a really privileged position working with lots of really big clients on setting up their projects and also assuring them. And then I have been quite deliberately provocative with the title of this segment to say that project controls is out of control. And that's really quite a bold statement. So I better say what I mean by that. So the business case of project controls is actually pretty good. There's lots of different estimates out there, loads of different numbers. But suggestion is that project controls on a big project probably cost somewhere around 2 to 3% of the overall project. And then there's a study by the other IPA, the independent project analysis, who look mainly at oil and gas and other big projects, that the really well implemented project controls can give you improved cost performance of around 10%. So business case there is pretty good, right? Spend 2-3%, save 10%. We're all good. Except that implementing really good project controls is really, really hard. And I'm not going to go into all the reasons for that. We know those. We start too late. Every project is bespoke, all of those things. But the issue is that when project controls is not implemented well, it leads to a whole host of problems. So it leads to silos where cost and time and risk and what's happening on the ground are not related. It reduces our agility because we create this massive machine, and we have to be agile. Any project is a dynamic environment. We're disempowered in the 20 years I've been in the industry, really disempowered project managers. And I'm going to talk about that quite a lot more. And we've created multiple versions of the truth. So a lot of the projects that I look at, there'll be a version of the truth that comes up from the project management and delivery community. There'll be another one from project controls. And some of the worst examples are the third one from finance. And Mark and his colleagues on the board are receiving all this and thinking, oh my goodness, how are we supposed to know where we are? And that leads to then delays in decision making and knock-on delays and costs in the project. So all of that leads our stakeholders to feel that the project's not under control, and what do? They have more control. So we get more layers of control and we get more silos, and we create this cottage industry of data and reporting and this desperate sense that if only we could get the right controls in place and if only we could get a perfect baseline, everything would be okay. And I think that we are definitely in Mark's bottom quadrant of fantasy. And I think we know that. So I'm going to give a bit of an example. If I described 2 candidates for a project manager role, and let's have a think about which one we'd pick. Candidate A, they've got 30 years experience, they've been there, they've done it, they've got the t-shirt. They're okay with the standard software, but they prefer to be on the ground, out talking to people, finding out what's really going on, building relationships. Candidate B, they've got 5 years experience, but they worked on a really high profile project that's considered by the industry to be best in class. And they bring state-of-the-art software analysis and a digital control center. Which of those 2 are we going to pick? And most of us, I think, would pick the candidate with the experience and the relationship focus every single time. But then when we come to set up a major project, we don't do that. We know deep down that projects are delivered by people and not by systems. But what happens is we invest a lot of money in the systems and the tools and the processes, and then we can't find the right people to run them. So I'm going to hypothesize what would happen if we turn some of this on our heads, if we rehumanized project controls around real world human behaviours and what actually gets things done. And I think in some ways it's quite simple. There are two components to it. The first one is basics, and the second one is behaviours. And we can use this quite simple thing to design a project controls approach that really works for real people. So starting with the basics, the thing I want to start with, and Mark's already used this word, is mindset. What is the mindset we need our project team to have? So number one, we need to have a planning mindset. That's absolutely critical. We know we can't deliver these things without a good plan. But I think we've forgotten what a plan is. A plan is primarily a tool of communication. It's about coordinating lots of people, doing lots of activities that are interconnected. So what if we worried a bit less about having a 5-year plan that's fully detailed, that's cost loaded, resource loaded, all of those things, and actually focused a bit more on making sure everyone knows what they're doing next week, everyone knows what they're doing next month. We've really talked about how we're going to do these things. We've found the issues, we're communicating, we're all aligned and going in the same direction. Similarly with risk, we know that managing risk is absolutely critical on a major project, but most of the risk registers I come across in my work are really a waste of time, and they're a waste of time because they don't drive action. So what if we worried a bit less about the perfect risk register and scoring and quantifying and identifying, and worried a bit more about managing those risks and actually taking ownership for them, doing something differently? And finally, with cost, of course cost is important, and we know this, but if you can't tell me what you're going to spend next month, do I really believe you can tell me what you're going to spend in 5 years' time? So again, we've got to have the full life cost estimate for the project, of course we do, but maybe we need to worry a lot more about the near-term estimating, the productivity, the risks, what's really going on, what's going to happen the next month and the month after that, and a little bit less about what's going to happen in 5 years' time. And then more important than those basics even is the behaviours. And again, Mark said this already, because we've fallen for this illusion. We've fallen for the illusion that our role as project leaders is to control a project rather than to manage a project. And they're very different mindsets. So what would managing a project look like? For me, it looks like empowering project managers to make decisions and use their judgment. And then incentivising project managers to actually manage the project, to own and manage the plan for their project or their part of the project, to own the cost and the forecasting, critically the forecasting and the risks. And then giving the levers to do something about that. There's no point having the accountability for your bit of the plan if you've got no levers. So you have to have some ability to have some resource or some costs and to move things around, to manage those things as they're actually happening. And then we have to align performance incentives to that. And Mark's talked already a bit about speaking truth to power and fear of failure. And this is just absolutely critical for me. On time on budget culture drives really counterproductive outcomes. And actually, we need to be focusing on forecasting and active risk management and those open conversations that solve challenges. And I did a really interesting experiment about 5 or 6 years ago now with a big utility where we banned on time on cost. No project manager was incentivised on time on cost. What they were measured on was their forecast. 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, 12 months look back. And it revolutionised the culture in that organisation. But in parallel with that, we did have to change the behaviours from the top. And the overall programme director on that programme, it was a multi-billion-pound programme, sat down with me and said, look, we're really happy with all this work you've done. We're happy with the new processes. We're happy with the new systems. But really, Lisa, the one thing I need you to do is get my people to use their judgment. And I was taken aback a bit by that. And I thought about it. And then I realised what the problem was. The problem was that people couldn't use their judgment because it wasn't psychologically safe in that environment to use their judgment. It wasn't safe to say, hang on, we've got a problem here. So you get reporting, and we've all seen it, where it goes green, 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 or a black hole. And we have to create those environments, and it comes from the top. So in that organisation, probably the thing that changed things more than anything else, a bit about re-incentivising the project managers and what they're focused on, but mainly about incentivising the conversation from the top person down through the organisation. And we had the same again in the next organisation that we went with. Things started to shift when the CEO shifted his behaviour, was having a different conversation with his direct reports and then down through the organisation. So we absolutely could talk about what was really going on and solve those real problems rather than the fantasy world that we're operating in. And then the final bit is we have to invest. We have to invest in skills as much as we invest in tools. And again, I think we very often forget this. So I have a bit of a mantra that my team get really bored of hearing me say, but it's mindset, skill set, tool set, in that order. So mindset first, what's the culture? What's the way we want to run this program? Skill set second. We're never going to have the perfect people. So let's make sure that we're really investing in upskilling our people and enabling them and empowering them to do the jobs that we need them to do. And then tool set finally. Tools are really important. All of those project controls techniques are important, but let's make sure it's a tool set that enables the behaviours of the skilled people that we've got on the programme. So to sum up, I do believe that project controls is out of control, but not because there's anything wrong with any of the project controls techniques, but it is about how we're using them. So if we stop trying to control our projects and instead think about how do we enable our teams to manage them and really rehumanise our project controls around those basics and behaviours we want to see, I think we've got a much better chance of being successful. So that was all that I have to say. Lucian, back over to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Lisa. That was really great. And I think I like the kind of the part of when you mentioned the risk registers and how, you know, looking at how to log the perfect risk, but it's also how do you manage it and how do you actually address it and have action from it as well. Cool, thank you. So our next speaker is Jo Elman-Brown, and she will be discussing the IPA's perspective on project controls.
Thank you. I will be, and I'm just going to share my slides, so just bear with me while I launch them. Apologies, just taking a bit longer than planned. Right, here we go. No. We'll get there. Okay, right, hopefully now you'll be able to see the slides. So I'm just going to actually properly launch them. So if you can't see these, please do let me know. So apologies. So I'm going to run through 10 minutes of IPA's perspective on project controls and my own perspective on project controls. Some of this might be a little simplified, but I think we've got quite a wide-ranging audience today. So I'll skip through the first two quite quickly. IPA do a lot of work in the background with upskilling and, you know, supporting departments and our major projects with, you know, what is best practice. And, you know, central to this is this idea of the principles of project success. And I'm sure all of you on the call will be, you know, used to talking about the project life cycle and those key stages, 3 stages really through a project. Today, really, I'm focusing on, you know, the project controls cycle within that. And for me, that cycle most often is daily, it's weekly, it's monthly, it's through the whole duration of the project that we should be thinking about what we're planning, how we're doing the work, how's it progressing, how do we realistically assess that, and then do we need to adjust? And some of those are really nuanced, and as Mark and Lisa have both mentioned already, you know, it's very much a people cycle. So I think everyone on this call is also aware of what are the key project controls, but at IPA, we've had a fair amount of debate about this over the last year as to how you really package up what project controls is. You know, for me, central to this, it's scope and benefits, it's planning, time management, it's managing the costs, risks, and quality. And those lines underneath this little drawing here that you see, I see those really as enablers. So how we manage data, data flow, performance, change management, governance, they're all really key to this whole package of project controls. But those are ultimately the sort of enabling strategies that sit behind the key elements. So as Lisa's already talked about, you know, this is about providing focus and direction and insights and giving project managers primarily that opportunity to make real-time decisions based on real evidence and real data. So Across IPA, obviously, we're looking at the biggest projects, and I've tried to take a step back this last few days and think about what is really making a difference in this project control space. First off, we need to embrace the reds. So I think Mark's already talked about truth to power, and this is central to it. There is definitely a culture, I think, within government projects of a fear of a red result, be that quarterly reporting or an assurance review. And actually, I think we need to step back and question what sort of behaviour that drives right the way down the supply chain, right down to subcontractors. Where I've come from, I really do believe you need to embrace that bad news early on, and that actually having sight of those results that are flashing up red, or wherever in the supply chain it is, or the management chain, and whatever stage of the project you're at, that does really enable you to start mitigating problems early and looking at your options. Second up, I would say data flow is central to this. I don't want to get too bogged down in discussions about data, but ultimately the speed of how the data flows through the chain from your subcontractors and suppliers all the way up to sometimes even top departments number 10 in government projects and exec boards in private sector. Sometimes that data can take 2 or 3 months, and it's quite shocking, I think, often at management level, to be looking at a spreadsheet that you really believe is the true position of the day, and then really go digging on it and discover that your cost data comes from 2 months ago and the schedule was cut 6 or 7 weeks ago. So it's really, really key to challenge underneath the data sometimes, and particularly at management level. I think it's key that we empower our teams to look at this, empower people to be able to challenge how long things take, and then also look at what you can strip out in that process. Because each stage of a data process inevitably can lead to a filtering out of the bad news, and it can lead to summarization and a distilling of the truth. And so that's why looking at data flow for me is really critical. It helps flush out where you might not be getting the full picture, where you need it for decisions. Third up, planning is absolutely a communication tool, and Lisa touched on this just now, which was a joy to hear. I spend a fair amount of time debating with colleagues about the need for a heavily resourced up, hugely detailed P6 schedule on major multi-million and billion-pound projects. Absolutely, of course, you need a really robust schedule, but central to the schedule is that, for me, it really needs to plot out the path through a project so that everybody can really understand that. And a really good schedule for me is something that can be rolled up at the highest level and put in front of a board or put in front of a team of new starters, and immediately people can see that roadmap through a project and can start to understand where are the really key stages, where are the key milestones, where are key decision points. And from that, beneath that, everything should then flow for contracts and for how you monitor your progress against that. But fundamental communication is the number one use of it. Fourth up, I think there is a real tendency in the project control as well to be backward looking. It drives a massive reporting culture, and certainly there's a lot of cottage industry and a proliferation of PMO teams that can grow from this sort of need to use all these tools and collate all this huge amount of data and churn out some sensible dashboards at the end of it and reports. Just by having that amount of data, it can really, really result in being backwards looking the whole time. And so at a management level, actually shifting that monthly and quarterly challenge point and starting to shift the conversations that we're having around the table into forward looking, what's coming next, what are we doing in the next 4 weeks, 8 weeks, next 3 months, next 6 months, and really looking at that enabling decision making.
Sorry to interrupt, Jo, but we're only seeing slide 2 of your slide deck. I don't think we're moving on to your
apologies. All
other
right,
points.
bear with me 1 minute. Let me just stop and then start again.
There we go. Got it.
Sorry, is it there?
We can see that now. Thanks.
Okay. So, can you, if I flick through, can you see all of these now? Hopefully so. If you can't see 5 boxes on your screen, please shout. So I got to number 4, the move from backward-looking reporting to really forward-looking enabling culture. And then the 5th point really is invest in good people and develop your project control expertise. Now this, I think, is a massive challenge for all of us. Traditionally, private sector projects ultimately will pay for more expertise in the project control space. And it's the challenge in public sector often to be able to push the boundaries on that and really make a strong argument to say that you're expert in planning or you're expert in cost management or risk management is absolutely as valuable to you as, you know, your senior project manager or some of your project directors. You need that expertise at top level to be able to really support into your project directors and help them make the decisions that are needed. It's not to take away from that chain of command of project management, but really I see that expertise at top level is a massive benefit. It's difficult to come by in the UK, and I think there's been some really great steps over the last few years in developing the training routes for project controls. But you know, it's incumbent on all of us to keep promoting that idea that a career in project controls is, you know, hugely valuable and can lead to, you know, great steps in the future. So that's my 5 kind of key points of what I think makes a difference. And I think I'm probably running out of time, but I'm just going to land on the final slide, which is a bit of a push towards some of the publications that exist out there. There is a huge amount of data online. If you're a civil servant, there's a lot on the Project Delivery Hub. There are some great...
The slide hasn't moved on.
Okay, don't worry. I don't need the slide. All I wanted to do really was to plug the fact that within IPA, we've got a huge amount of publications. So please do reach out and let me know if you need any info. And there's a Project Controls Expo that comes up in November, which is a 2-day event, and a lot of people that are on this call will probably be there already, and some will be presenting. It's a great opportunity to hear about what's going on in this space. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Jo. That was really insightful. I liked how the 2 points of the data flows and also the backwards looking perspective. So it's kind of makes it difficult to have that forward looking perspective. The data that people are receiving is 2 or 3 months old. So it's how can we kind of make that data up to date so we can get better informed forward looking decision making. So our final speaker is Beth West, and she will be talking about how East West Rail picks up the baton from Crossrail.
Thanks, Lucian. Thank you. Can everybody? I've been having a bit of connectivity problems, so can everybody hear me before I crack on? Brilliant. Thank you. And I am in the manner of Soviet leaders of bald hair. I'm in the slides, no slides, slides. I'm in the no slide camp. So I will try to do my best. And this is when I always have Mark test me to make sure I've been listening in terms of lessons learned from Crossrail. But I just wanted to start a little bit with an introduction to East West Rail and East West Rail Company. And then I'll talk about the lessons that we've learned from Crossrail and then close on how we're trying to think about these within the East West Rail context. So East West Rail is a new railway line between Oxford and Cambridge. Service is already operational between Oxford and Bicester. Construction is about 80% complete on the route between Bicester and Bletchley, and services are expected to open in mid-2025. We announced our route upgrades between Bletchley and Bedford, and then our route selection between Bedford and Cambridge back in May. And what we're doing now is working really hard on our design so we can move to a statutory consultation for the development consent order process. And we want to have that statutory consultation next year so we can submit our DCO application the following year. East West Railway Company is an arm's length body of the Department for Transport, and we were established way back in 2018 to deliver this new railway in a different way from large projects of the past. And I think we've probably all been, as people who work on mega projects, all have been said that one way or other in the past as well. But it is really important that we learn from everyone else because there's value in every project. But from Crossrail specifically, some things that we learned are really about the minimum viable product and a modular approach. We don't need to have a gold-plated option. For East West Rail, we've got this first phase under construction, and we will be able to learn from those in terms of how we're delivering. And a modular approach allows us to update as we progress. We really want to simplify. Again, I think Mark talks about this a lot, but related to MVP, we have complex projects, but sometimes as project teams, we make them more complicated. I think, Lisa, we touched on this in terms of trying to have all the whiz-bang things, but we need to take a step back and look how we can streamline. From Crossrail, we can see an upward trend of pushing back against industry norms, and we don't need to continue to do things the old way if there's a new and simpler way of doing things. We want to keep an open mind. Crossrail had a shift in mindset from the outset, but really only embraced the change of the status quo in the later stages because it have to. But the other thing is that big infrastructure isn't just about infrastructure and shovels in the ground. It's just as much about technology and digital and data. And we're trying to pay heed to this in the early stages of the project so that we can bring dividends at the end. And the benefits of tech, as I think we all know, is that we can test before we build and create data feedback loops to apply learning as we go. Collaboration and ways of working. Lisa was talking about how this is, we tend to ignore people, but people are what make projects happen. And collaboration, though, doesn't happen, especially in our hybrid world. And we need some structural change to make that happen. And we can't just hope it's going to happen. So we've tried to approach our operational structure, our organizational structure, so we can be focused on collaboration. And we do also know from Crossrail that collaboration between suppliers and partners is really needed when things go wrong. But also, if you want to make some progress, you need to get that collaboration happening early in the process with your supply chain. And then the other thing we learned, the takeaway for me is lessons that are applied on Crossrail aren't necessarily directly comparable to what we can do on East West Rail. There are lessons from every project, but it's never a straight shift in time. Markets change, economics change, demand changes. There are a lot of things that will change that require us to take the lessons and apply them to our own context, rather than just saying, well, this worked on Crossrail, so it must work for us, or this didn't work for Crossrail, so we obviously can't apply it here. So what does this mean in practice for how we're approaching this question of orienteering? I think the first thing to say is to know where you are in your project lifecycle. Every project needs good governance and good project management discipline, but in early stages of a program like we are, you don't need to build the colossal governance structure just to get things done. And in fact, decisions will be made a lot more quickly if you don't have a complicated governance structure, but rather keep it simple and focus on that MVP for process and governance in the early days. I think the second thing is really to stick to your purpose, your vision and mission for your decision making. In 2021, there was a lot of doubt about whether or not the Bedford to Cambridge part of our route was going to happen at all. So we went back to our business case and looked to make sure there was a business case for the project. And as part of that process, we confirmed that our purpose is to unlock sustainable growth between Oxford and Cambridge. Not just to put down some railway infrastructure that various operators could use, but to drive opportunities across the region that wouldn't otherwise be unlocked without the railway infrastructure. So what this means is that we drive our decision-making off this purpose. We're in the process of defining our vision for what that means for the railway itself, for the design, for the even going into what we think the future operations are going to be like. And that's about being a reliable commuter railway that will allow people to make life choices because they know that East West Rail will get them to work or school or however they're going to spend their days. And everyone's talked about this, especially at this early stage of the program. We need to be flexible. The timing of our DCO process runs right across the next general election, so we're going to need to adapt our program to the timing. We obviously can't re-baseline every week, but we need to be able to adapt to uncertainty and flex our program if the political timing changes or if there's new information that's discovered. Collaboration, it's hard, but we're only delivering one thing in the end, and a railway above everything, probably any other bit of infrastructure really does need to be integrated. We're also trying to make sure that we're integrating with our communities. So this adds another layer of complexity in our thinking. But we don't want to just throw down some infrastructure and hope the communities work around us, because that wouldn't be a good use of taxpayers' money. So we have to think really hard about how we're collaborating. How do we bring in that community focus to make sure we're designing the right thing? And it's not just telling that, it's not, we're not trying to do things to, having people feel like they're being done to. We have to bring that in and co-create with them. So finally, with all of this in mind, how do we navigate our way through this complicated landscape? This is stating the obvious point, but we obviously have to start with the end in mind, making sure that we're focused on that unlocking sustainable growth between Oxford and Cambridge. And then learning the lessons of all that have gone before us, but recognize that our situation and our objectives are different, so that these lessons need to be applied selectively and appropriately. And we need to be mindful of the stage of the project lifecycle that we're in, but also prepare for the next ones and build and adapt our capability to fit the next stage that we're in. And that's all I wanted to really cover today. So we can get on to the questions. Thank you. Did I pass,
Great.
Mark?
Makes me very happy that, yeah, well, more than that, I think you're doing I think you're doing a great job with your project. But yeah, it's great to hear the lessons percolating in. It's really good, yeah.
Thanks, Mark.
Great, thank you, Beth. And yeah, I really like the view on keeping it simple and kind of looking at that MVP and how you deliver those projects. So thank you to all the speakers, and I think we're going to move on to some Q&A now. I've seen there's a bit of activity in the chat, so there's a couple of questions, but feel free to put your questions in the chat or raise your hand up, and I'll point on you to ask a question out loud as well. I think I'll take chair's privilege and kick off with the first question. So this one's for Beth. You mentioned how to kind of drive that collaboration and ways of working with the organization and suppliers and partners. How do you do that when it's different organizations who have different governance structures, and maybe even in the contracts with the delivery, they may not be required to share certain amounts of data and things like that? How would you kind of go around that challenge, essentially?
Well, I have the luxury of not having many contracts yet. So I think the big thing for us is specifying what it is that we want. I mean, I think I have an aversion to massive reporting teams because I think that's slightly soul destroying as an activity. So, the ideal scenario is to be really clear in our contracting about what data that we're expecting from people, and then have that integrate into our systems. I think there were a bunch of questions about real-time data. I think that to the extent that we can move to Joe's point about not being backward looking, but how do we get that real-time data? The only way we can get that is if we're really sucking the data out of our contractors. But that's about how we specify and how we engage to do that. We need to have a good front end to be able to have a look at it. But it's really thinking about, everybody's got data and it's how do we harness it and use it? And I don't have the answers yet, but it's something I'm really keen that we focus on as we're building our delivery strategy, because what I want out of data is, what 3 phone calls do I need to make today? What are the things, back on Joe's point on the reds, I want to focus on the reds because I want to know as soon as they exist that they're there, so we can address them quickly and not wait till sometime in the future when it's really a problem.
Yeah, no, exactly. Thank you. Thanks for that. I think we've got a question in the chat from Natasha. To all the speakers, how do you achieve psychological safety on major projects and programs?
I'll have a go, listen. I think I've come to realize that we should engineer our environment and our teams as much as we should engineer the infrastructure. You know, we spend a lot of time engineering the virtual or the physical world, but we should engineer our environment. So I think the first thing is the people in charge of these programs need to think very carefully about how they engineer an environment that would create psychological safety. So, for example, people talk about diversity and inclusion. It's obviously ethically the right thing to do, but really the reason you would want a diverse and inclusive environment is it greatly increases psychological safety if you've got like all the talents. Other things you can do are, you know, the shadow we cast as leaders. Beth just said it actually, you know, looking for the reds. There's a great one, you know, let's just have a look. What does it mean? I think, you know, I've been in so many project reviews with really, dare I say, quite aggressive leadership. Might not, it's not a gender thing either, by the way. I've seen as many kind of assertive female leaders as male leaders, but you know, if you start to really push people hard on don't bring me problems, bring me solutions, you quickly end up with people not quite telling you the truth. So I think it's about engineering the environment, Lucy, and I don't know what other colleagues think, but I think you could make it. You know, you can engineer it, you can create the conditions, I would have thought.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. And, you know, reflecting on some of the lessons from some of the projects in the last few years, I sort of quite often say that you can't build a railway until you've built an organisation that can build a railway. And I think sometimes we forget that step, and we're already behind at the point where we start trying to build the railway, and we don't take the time to build that organisation. But then exactly as Mark said, it's completely about the conversation that's coming from the top. So and all of us do this, every single one of us do it as project managers, you want to be green, you want to be on time, you want to be on budget, and you'll probably convince yourself a bit, and you'll certainly convince your team that you can sort it out next month. And actually creating that conversation where the leadership really wants to know where the big challenges are, not every single thing, but the big challenges where they are, but then leans in with you to fix them is the important thing. So it can't be that sort of blame culture of, well, how are you going to fix it? It has to be, how are we going to fix it? And I think that's what makes a difference.
I think there are a couple things that I would add to that, because I think you need to build your organization, and then you need to make sure that the people that you are adding to your organization are capable for the roles they're in. I think that there's a lot of, if you blame culture can come not necessarily from the top, but it certainly can come from the top, but it also can come from people who are insecure about their own positions. And so if they're not quite confident of what they're doing, there can be excuses that come along with, I'm not really sure how to do it. So I think that we've got to make sure we're putting people into roles they're capable of delivering. And I think the other thing is, how do we respond when there is bad news? So I was saying to somebody the other day, if somebody's really good at their job, the person who's going to be beating themselves up about something most about going wrong isn't any of us. It's going to be that individual. And so when something goes wrong, they shouldn't get a bollocking, but rather you're still really valued in the organization. How are we going to sort it out? I think I went so far as to say they need a cuddle, which might be extreme, but it is good people will beat themselves up when things go wrong. And so what they need to know is they're still valued, and that the problem can be sorted. And it's how do you collectively solve the problem? And of course people have to be accountable, but it's a how do you get that positive environment that people feel happy to bring the reds.
Great, thanks everyone. We've got a question in the chat from Neil. I don't know if Neil, you'd want to come off mute to ask a question. It's Neil Rigby. Or if not, I'll read it out. So it was mentioned that projects are bespoke, which is generally the case, but the information required to control them is largely the same. Why don't consultants and clients have an agreed set of universal controls? Consultants are working on many projects and should be able to leverage their experience in multiple project types. So it's essentially, why don't consultants and clients have an agreed set of universal controls for projects?
Maybe I can have a go. Go on, Joe, go.
You're on mute, Joe.
Sorry, I'm happy for Lisa to go first, but I will just jump in. I mean, it's a really good question. I think the question that there are too many systems out there, and they're very different. So different projects sort of demand and different clients, like to work with different systems, and some of those have different outputs. Some of them all feed into the same type of dashboard and output. I think the beauty of it now is that almost every digital system you can stitch together. So it's less now about the fact that you've got different control systems out there and different methods. It's more about how do we build data that's comparable. So how do we take data from a rail project and pull out the bits that are really comparable to roads or to, building, and be able to compare across on performance data and challenge across industry as to where one sector might be going faster and better and more efficient compared to another. So I think it's probably less now about universal controls and more about how do we get some sort of universal data model out of it that's usable. Lisa might be able to articulate something better than me, I think.
Well, no, I'm going to completely agree with you. So I do think we can standardise more, and I do think that there is benefit in that. But actually, we have to recognise that all of these projects are different. Their needs are different, and I get asked probably more than anything, what's best practice? There isn't best practice. There's the best fit of practice for your project and your circumstances and the resources you've got and the challenges you've got. So I think we have to recognise that it is always going to be bespoke, and it's going to be different people as well. And again, I think we forget this. So depending on the culture of your leader and your leadership team, you might want something very different. Some people are really hands-on and detail orientated. They'll want to know a lot. Other people really just want to manage by exception. So there is something there around having a more standardised set of things, but recognising we've always got to tailor it to the environment that we're working in.
Yeah. I also think Beth said something which really kind of resonated with me about, if I could paraphrase you, Beth, you said something about the next phase. You're in the current phase of a project, but you're trying to project to the next phase. And in Crossrail, it took us 1 year to work out what to measure. It took us a year. Admittedly, the thing was a pickle. It was in a pickle. But it took us a year to work out what to measure. And by the time we worked it out, the game had changed again because the project had moved somewhere else. So I would say I disagree with a common tool set. I think I hate the word nimble, but you get the sense you need to be a bit nimble about what you measure, and what you measure matters. I forget whose law it is. When a measure becomes a target, it is no longer useful, and that's kind of what happened in Crossrail. The measure became the target. Inevitably, people calibrated to the target and stopped measuring. The act of measurement is to presumably inform decision making. So I think Beth had the right sense, and maybe it's not just the next phase; it's the progression to the actual end goal. But I think that might be, if I was a major project controls person, that's where I'd get to. And then you think about AI and how you might calibrate AI tools around this could get quite interesting. But I think a fixed tool set isn't the way it's going to happen. I don't think.
I think there's also, Mark, isn't there? There's quite often a real push to have that ability to compare back to day one, and have that whole life perfectly measured. But I think that's just not real life, and I agree with you that through a project you're going to have peaks and troughs, or when you're going to want to measure something totally different. So yeah, having that agility to change what you measure through a life cycle is really important.
But we've all read Ben Flyberg's book. I bet we've all read Ben's book, and in there, it kind of rips off Kahneman a bit, doesn't it? But it kind of talks about the planning fallacy of repetitively planning the same thing, expecting you're going to get like a better output, using the assumptions that you've had in the past, with ever decreasing circles. I think the planning fallacy is a real thing. You get trapped trying to measure a system integration project with civil engineering tools. It never kind of works,
Yeah.
Great, thanks everyone. We've got another question from Paul. So, does RAG, or red, amber, green, drive the wrong behaviors? People trying to avoid moving to the next worst color is there a better way?
I'm a bit old school, really. Well, first of all, we banned yellow in Crossrail. Don't want to be, you know, it was nothing particularly not liking the color. It was yellow promoted people to sit in the middle, you know, sit on the fence, yellow, amber, whatever, you know, you kind of hedge your bets, you know, like I said, amber, red being the absolute worst possible color. So the color rating for me was just a means of promoting a conversation. Now, somebody could come up with a different methodology, but that's only somebody put in the chat. The key was to get the conversation going and get the curiosity going. And somebody said in the chat, it was really insightful. They said, you know, reds are good because they're meaty, they're conversational. You can have a conversation about leadership, about possibility in a red. And I bet in all of our lives, you know, the human history and art and architecture, politics, the value comes out of the I wouldn't say the conflict, but the natural tension of things. So I don't know what other colleagues think. I mean, reds and greens kind of work for me, only to promote the conversation. I'm sure you could have a different method, but colors are as good as any. I mean, it's more important that you get people not to feel embarrassed that they could ratchet up to the next level.
I think it's not conflating it also with whether or not you're any good as a project manager. Being green doesn't mean you're good. And I think that that's the bit where we go wrong. So then people, you know, I've had so many conversations when we do assurance reviews where people are desperately fighting that it's all green. And you're like, well, it isn't. Objectively, it isn't. And actually, we need to be able to have that conversation. It's not a reflection on you as a project manager that it isn't. There are lots of circumstances that have caused that. And I think that's the bit we've got to get away from. So that fear of things being red drives some of the wrong behaviours, and that then comes into our incentive systems and the whole cultural piece.
And I think this goes into how do we? It's not red, amber, green. It's about data, and it's about how do we use data to build trust. To have, you know, because part of this is to get to a solution and to get through that conflict, you actually have to trust the parties in the room to work with you to get to that place. So the more we can drive that challenging conversation based on actual data rather than, you know, decision by anecdote or conflict by anecdote, we're in a better place. So it is how do we have an objective conversation that takes the emotion out, that allows us to move into problem solving and not go, well, you said and me. You know, the data is there to help the conversation, and so however you do it, it's about calibrating the data properly to allow you to have that conversation. So if you know, a long time ago when I was at the underground, we would argue about where were the measures in the risk register between the, you know, when they would go from green to amber. And I used to be really cheeky and try to push it so that lots of things were, you know, to be on the other side, to make things red and amber, to have the conversation rather than to paint the picture that everything's green. And you can make things green if you put the targets in a different place, but you're not having the conversation.
I really, that resonates. Just while we've got project professionals on the call, like I've been very lucky in my career to work with the very, very best. You know, I would name some people that, not me, by the way, but I've just been proximate to absolute the best I've ever seen in projects. And they all generally had a trait of existing in programs around P40 to P50. I think the problem, it's okay saying, right, we want things to be red for conversation. The problem I really see is when project controls people start to ratchet it down to like P0 and deterministic programs. Because if you've got no air in any program, people don't like to lose. And if you're at P0, and that's where Crossrail ended, chasing a P0 program, everybody was losing every day and everything was red. And eventually, psychologically, you start to resign psychologically to be like any, you know, I'm not a massive sports fan, but you know, you see sports teams that get beaten over and over again. Eventually, they get expecting to be beaten. You know, they lose the ability to win. So I think for project controls people, you have to create truth to power. For you would be to create enough air in the system where people can show their reds, but they can win. You know, and I remember Jim Crawford at the end. I'd put him in the top echelon. At the end of Crossrail, Jim delivered about P45 program. To me, it's kind of world class. He had a P50 date, he had a P80 date, and he delivered it about P45. And he said to me, look, Mark, we're getting away from this P0 because we're losing every day. And people are losing heart. So I think there is something actually You've got to keep people's motivation, so you don't want everything to be red. Otherwise, you kind of collapse in a crisis of confidence. And I think that is a role for project controls professionals to become conscious to creating the space for people to win.
Yeah, it's absolutely critical that teams have a program or a project plan that they really have belief in, isn't it? It's because as soon as people have lost that belief that the plan on the wall is total rubbish, then it's game over. You're losing time every single day. So I think the biggest challenge, and there's probably a few planners on the call, and I've certainly been here myself earlier in my career, is when you've got management above saying, I'm not going to accept these dates. Bring me a plan that shows how we meet this date. And this still happens every day on a lot of our major schemes, doesn't it? And breaking that taboo of really putting the truth on the table is the only way forward. And so my plea to all the project controls on the call is, be brave, stick to your guns, put the truth on the table.
And I think there's something that we have to be really honest about here. So I have this debate quite a lot. I do believe there should be more than one version of the plan. There should be a top-down plan, which is generally fairly aspirational. Now there's a bottom-up plan, which is probably fairly conservative. And the job is bringing those two together. So every plan has to work top-down, bottom-up, right, left, right. And that bit in the middle, that's where we earn our money. And I think too often we shy away from that and we spend all our time trying to make them match. They won't ever match. But let's understand in that conflict in the middle, what is it that we need to be really focusing on to make it happen?
And
yeah, I agree.
Some of you will know Steve Livingston, who delivered T2, and he was on our board and he was massively influential in this, Lisa, and he did exactly that. He got us to do the top down, bottom up. And in that space was the art of major programs management. He thought it as the art, keeping enough tension and push to the project teams, but giving enough confidence to stakeholders of a date they could rely on. And he was really influential with me, Steve, and he said, that's the art, Mark. That's what you're here for. Top down, bottom up, manage the constructive gap internally and externally, and it's kind of what you're paid for. And I think the key is, all of these lessons, where do they go to young emerging professionals? That's kind of what we're here for. How do you, people like Steve Livingston and Jim have earned it over 30 or 40 years of working. How do you fast track a new generation of people who, haven't yet cut their teeth? It's quite exciting, I suppose.
I think it's the same with cost as well. So there shouldn't be one version of how much a project's going to cost. Again, there's a top-down cost, but we'd like it to come in at and maybe the number that we've got publicly. And then we need to be, again, working in that space in the middle and bringing the two together. And I think that's also somewhere where we get ourselves in quite a muddle. So I very often when I'm working with big government departments, and Joe, it'd be interesting to hear your view on this, really encouraging them to keep some stuff in the back pocket. Like don't give the project team all the money that there is. Recognise that there will need to be something for you as the owner that's not necessarily declared at this stage. And again, working that space in the middle is the job for leadership.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, it's a real challenge in public sector because we have to be above board. We have to disclose what is being spent on a project. And, ultimately, Treasury do not like the environment where money is kept in the back pocket in a secret account somewhere. And so it's really, really hard. I mean, I think where we've got departments that are managing big portfolios, they've got more ability to manage that flex within a portfolio, but certainly on mega projects where it's a single budget line, it's jolly difficult to do that. Private sector, it's much more easy to do. And I think, probably like you, Lisa, I've been in places where your cost management team these days are very adept at measuring that top down and bottom up, and certainly some great tools that help you do that. It's much harder to do that on the planning side, and we're much more reliant on that depth of expertise of what I would call real planners. We've got years of being trained up to really understand how to do that and how to manage everything on a schedule that way. But it sounds like that's the next good lecture to and workshop maybe to run is quite a planning focused one to bring in some of the experts would be a really good session.
Yeah, definitely. I think Andy have his ears pricked for that one. All thanks for great discussion there. There's a hand up in the chat. I think it's Alexander. If you wanted to come off mute and share your question.
Yeah, hi. Afternoon all. Really interesting listening into this, although I think, you know, it's perception is reality. I saw a title on orienteering in major projects, and I've heard about project controls, and I'll stick my hand up now. I'm not project controls, and if I knew that, I probably would have been on the call. So, you know, you've always got to sometimes listen in and learn something else. However, coming back to orienteering, also takes me back to a sport I've been involved in, but you know, orienteering, there's a couple of sort of, I suppose, keys to success, and slow down to speed up. Orienteering, you tend to run about 2 to 3 times slower than you'd run normally. So you run across the map, you go too fast. You know, to find your target, you've got to find your attack point first to narrow in. And then also, you know, it's about following the handrail. So using that idea of the analogies and something I'm interested in, you know, from your experience, and I don't know who wants to sort of catch this one or one of you sort of take it, but, you know, what have you done to slow down to speed up? What have you done to find that attack point to focus in on the detail? And then what's that handrail that you have followed and your teams have been able to follow to achieve the success you've obviously no doubt achieved?
I'll give you a good direct Crossrail lesson. It's a good point. So the classic think slow, act fast. So how can you do it in the heat of the moment? And on Crossrail, one of the breakthroughs in kind of my time was to become purposeful about the outcome. So unbelievably, you know, we didn't really have much of a vision on the outcome of Crossrail in the kind of construction phase. People thought it was possible to open an unreliable railway, which the operator would never accept. So the gap between delivery and operations always widened and nobody could ever come together.
Yeah.
So the minute we became purposeful and said, no matter what, we will open a reliable railway. The train won't be stuck in the tunnel more than 15 minutes. The MTBF of the train will be 20,000. The performance of the train will be 97%. The minute it was defined that the outcome, the place we were going to, the place in the future we'd converge on, was defined and crystallized, everybody had to stop because it changed the game. You know, because to get to the train up to a 20,000 mile MTBF, it needed a shed load of testing time in the tunnel, which meant the tunnel had to be complete and handed over to the train people. It completely changed the sequence. So my answer, Alex, would be the definition of the end is so important. I'm sure Beth thinks about this all the time. The minimum viable product, the stage gate, the stage configuration. If you can converge on that, everybody is forced to slow down.
Yeah.
Because often people get ahead of themselves because they're heading to a place that's either not committed or fantastical. And you know, I often say nothing to do with me. When we opened Crossrail, they had 5 consecutive 100% days. It's mathematically not possible. In 18 months testing before we got to opening it, couldn't get 100% day. 5 consecutive days when they opened to 100%. Why? Where extraordinary collective spirit to get to a pinnacle. It couldn't be held. You know, by day 6, it was 99%. But that kind of intervention of the future made everybody stop and think. But it was quite a disruptive thing and commercially difficult because we had to pay delay to a lot of people who wanted to finish.
Yeah.
So I guess some of this is in the commercial settlement. I think a lot of pressure comes from commercial management where clients have put too much risk into the supply chain. I bet Beth is thinking carefully about how much risk she should retain and how much you put into supply chain.
I've been known to go to talk to Treasury and say that risk transfer is not an inherent good. But that was a little while ago, so I'll have to dust that one off. I think the other thing we really haven't talked about very much is politics, though. And especially with mega projects, the big P politics plays a big part as well. And I think some of this is managing the big P politics, because often in that environment, you're not permitted to do some of the things that you're talking about. And it's you know, I think Mark, when he took over a Crossrail, would have been possibly viewed as brave to do some of the things that he did, because there was probably pressure to get a date that was, you know, in 2 weeks' time, wasn't there? So, there's a managing the big P politics on how this works is really important, because everybody wants to go to a ribbon cutting and everybody wants to put on their PPE and go on site, when actually the sensible thing might be to do is to do that, stop, slowing down, go slow to act fast.
Mhm.
But and I think, that is something that we have to manage, and it's sort of how do we actually craft a narrative that is allows us the space to be able to do that, and doesn't get politicians excited and pushing you for things that are unachievable, because that's often, getting the stick to this date, stick to this budget might be unachievable.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Great, thanks for all those remarks as well. There were some other questions in the chat. So one from Andy. So regarding the speed of data, should we do away with periodic reporting and simply use real-time data or near real-time data to make sense or to do reporting on our projects?
I don't mind having a first crack at this one. This is really difficult to do. I mean, there are a lot of good projects out there that are really trying to do real-time data reporting. If you were to take a smaller project or a single building, something that's much more manageable than the mega projects, then absolutely yes. Nowadays, it's much more realistic to be able to put in a regime and have a contracting regime in place where you can have that real-time flow. And in fact, on smaller projects, you're going to know it anyway, because half the time you've got co-located teams and someone's going to be walking through the, your office door to tell you what's going on. On mega projects, it's so much more difficult because of the layers of contracts that exist, and the volume of material and of data that's being shifted each month. So, I think certainly Hinckley that I've seen have had a really good demo working of how they use real-time data, and some of the big projects now are doing that, but it's hard to do. And I think it comes back to the politics point, that there are layers on top who ultimately are making big decisions, and the layers below want to be 100% sure that what they're presenting is right. And so those checks and balances start to put brakes in your data cycle straight off, as people want to check what they're feeding upstream. So you can only do it if you have a really open governance, decision-making process, no blame process, and an environment at the top where people are not going to overreact to seeing bad news in the data. And that, I'd say, really intelligent client that really understands the control data, that can look at it and think, okay, I'm going to let the contractors run with this, or let my project managers run with this, and then we'll have another look at it in a week's time or a month's time. Mark might have a view on that, but
No,
definitely trust is central to it all.
I just think that's a brilliant answer. I mean, for me, for new project controls people out there, there is data, there is information, and then there's insight. And really what you're after is insight. So I think it's entirely possible to have real-time insight. So for example, I went to the Bosch factory. Now I'm in the gas business. I went to the boiler manufacturer in Worcester. They produce a boiler every 42 seconds from this factory. It's quite something. Classic called a production line. And they've got real-time insight. Things that are insightful to them they're in real time, but they're not, they're not reviewing they're not doing like a periodic review, but things that are insightful. And insightful things to them are mostly about the supply chain of materials. It was insightful to them. The delays in the on the M42 were insightful to them. So I think for me, the question is, can project controls people start to think more about insight rather than information and data? Data is pretty pointless in real time, but insight, and there could be many things to think about. Certainly in Crossrail towards the end, the insightful thing was the performance of the train every single minute. Because when the train was out on the track, we really, you would know in real time the insight coming, particularly if anything had emerged that we need to know about and react to. And really, so if you've got like a blue color during the day in Crossrail, it meant all's well with the train. You've got a red, like the train was stuck in the tunnel and we didn't know what it was. it was insightful and you got onto it. Well, I didn't get on, they got onto it straight away. So I think, yeah, data, information and insight, not really well understood by the project controls fraternity. Sorry if I've upset any project control people right now.
And I completely agree with what you said there, Mark, but I sometimes forget that there's another source of insight that we often undervalue. So I'm sounding old now, but a long time ago when I first started out as a project manager, I got a tip from my mentor, and he said, Lisa, the most important hour of your week is 11 o'clock on a Thursday. And I'm like, what on earth is he talking about? And so I was like, okay, explain this to me. And he said, because that's the hour when you go for coffee with a contract manager from the contractor and you find out what's really going on. And I think that's the bit that we forget. And he was absolutely right. 11 o'clock on Thursday was the most important hour of the week. And yes, we had the governance meetings and all the other things, but that was when we could both put our cards on the table in an informal atmosphere and actually solve problems.
Yeah, I think that's central why I really love dashboards that have got, you know, that box where you can actually put some free text in there that allows project managers or whoever to actually, you know, write something that is real time and real life right into the middle of the data. Sorry, Mark, I jumped across you then.
Great, thanks everyone. I think we've got time for one more question. I've seen there was it Jason or Jonathan Farnborough who had a question in the chat and had the hand up earlier. I don't know if you wanted to come off mute to ask a question.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I'm supposed to come off mute because I'm a bit too disruptive. But yeah, I wanted to ask Beth. It was fascinating. You were talking about the early stages of the project and the very agile and effective decision making when you could do things in a kind of minimum viable way. And then you, by implication, you said, but of course, as you get further into the project, then the governance gets heavier. And I'm thinking, hang on, if it's so good, why don't we maintain that? Why are these extra layers of governance good if they actually make decision making slower, more opaque, maybe less effective?
It's an excellent challenge, and I hope that I rise to it. I mean, I think that one of the things that's really interesting now, and why I think governance it needs to be super simple, is actually we can make a small decision today that will cost a vast amount of money. So it means that I can't actually delegate various decisions to people because a small design decision could cost me hundreds of millions of pounds. So in one way, I'm not delegating authority. I have a simple governance process, but we're not delegating any authority to anyone because this is a really costly decision. Whereas when we move into delivery, when we're spending a lot more money, we should be able to get into more, back into the points about giving people a reasonable budget that they can manage to and make the changes and empowering project managers to get on and deliver their projects. So you do need to have a little bit more structure around that governance. You can't just have a really simple structure because you have more people and then you do have those delegated authorities, which isn't to say we should create bureaucracy for bureaucracy's sake, but it's about adapting to the nature and the size of the organization that you're going to be, the fact that there are contracts that are going to be sitting behind that. So it is just, again, it's being fit for purpose for the phase you're in. In no way do I want to create a massive amount of bureaucracy. I think it's a luxury to be basically an SPV because we only have one thing to worry about. So, going from being a single project to being a single project in a big organization, there's just different levels of bureaucracy. So I have a luxury to be an SPV, a relatively small mega project SPV, because I should be able to adapt my governance to be pretty agile still, even when we're getting into delivery. But when if you're the same size project, if I were sat in Network Rail, the rest of the organization is doing a lot of other stuff, right? There's a whole other world of governance that has to be dealt with, and I'd just be one little sideshow over here. So it's being fit for purpose for who you are and what you're doing, and at the right stage of the life cycle. Was that satisfactory or nearby satisfactory?
Well, no, that's fine. That's fine. I mean, I'd be tempted to throw it at Mark and say, Mark obviously got to that stage where you had a much more sophisticated governance model. and yet Crossrail ground to a screaming halt. So there's something that doesn't really work in the governance.
I think the thing that Beth's doing, the Crossrail, by the way, I was on the board of Crossrail when it all went wrong, so I'm like, I'm somewhat accountable. The thing that Beth's done that we didn't do before I took over as CEO, this idea of minimum viable product, and Crossrail. The reason Crossrail ground to halt in terrible governance suffocation was the whole concept of Crossrail was to build the cathedral and have everything ready on day one. It was completely insane. You look back and you go, what were we thinking? We're going to have every bell and whistle. For example, we opened Crossrail 6 days a week. Couldn't open it, couldn't run it on the 7th day because all of the trains were on the other side of London, and we need to use the tunnel to get them back to the other side for Monday morning because the diversionary routes weren't ready. So we needed the tunnel for empty stock moves. So that was like a minimum viable product. Only open the railway 6 days a week. Before like the light bulb moment, we tried to open a 7-day-a-week railway. And obviously you ground to a halt because nobody could make it work. So I think the key thing would be to keep the purity of your minimum viable product or your stage, your configuration state railway. Then when all the suffocating governance does come around, you've kind of got a North Star, which I think is what Beth's saying. There's a North Star that you're all coming to, and you won't deviate from it. And in Crossrail, the breakthrough for us was that we'd open a very reliable railway 6 days a week. And actually, we even knocked an hour off at the beginning and an hour off at the end to give the maintenance crews a bit more time just to get used to some of this new technology that they've got. These were like breakthrough thoughts. That the God's honest truth is, if Andrew Wilson was here saying this, to be fair to Andrew, the things that we did were seen to be completely impossible to do politically. And to Beth's point, it was very easy for me to do it because once you're in a hole, people would do anything to get out of it. The real question is for leaders like Beth, I suppose, how do they get the courage or the imprimatur to make these bold calls before they're in a mess? East West Rail is a successful project. So that's why I really applaud what Beth's doing. It's quite hard, though, to make tough calls early. It'll save you a shed load of time later.
Because everybody loves a crisis. Nobody gets points for not having a crisis, right?
Perfect. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to our speakers and for all the questions as well throughout that Q&A as well. That was a great session, really insightful and great discussion as well. I think I'm gonna hand back to Andy now for closing remarks.
Great, thank you, panelists, speakers, and can we have a round of applause for our guest chair today, Lucian, expertly emceed, brilliant. You kept it flowing, and great introduction and great allocation of questions to our panelists. So thank you very much, and thank you everyone for attending as well. So just a couple of things to close us out, where we're just heading up to the top of the hour. Just a bit of advertising for some future events. We're busy this month and next month. So next week we have another seminar in the afternoon. We'll be looking at the unresolved issue of estimating and forecasting, so not unlinked to this session. And then in the evening, having discussed the sort of the best practice, or I can't remember the exact term that Lisa just used there, the best placed practice, we'll then be looking at what digital and data can do to really solve that issue of estimating and forecasting. We have our simulator in October, takes you through the full life cycle of a project in one day. So pilots regularly use simulators on a regular basis. So I think project professionals, we should be doing the same. And then lastly, we have our session on what we can learn across different regulated industries, particularly with the rapid or the significant investment in water sector at the moment. So they're the 4 things that we've got coming up. And then lastly, I mentioned right at the beginning, we do have a feedback form. If you could just take 60 seconds or so to complete it. It's on Menti. You can see the link there, or click the QR code, and the code is 79593357. And for every bit of feedback we receive, we will be giving some money to Autism Oxford. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Great. Thanks, Andy.